Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, welcome back to Model 2 of this course on struggle-free healthy living and taking a spiritual approach to living healthy. So, the second model we're going to talk about is how to uproot afflictions. So, I kind of touched on it when I was talking a little bit about the when I was talking a little bit about the principles on the importance of dealing with different types of afflictions, etc. So we're going to talk about afflictions in this model. And the first thing I want to talk about is the causes. If we're going to uproot health afflictions of any sort, then we need to be aware of some of the causes of such health afflictions. So we're going to start off by talking about spiritual health afflictions. Again, I think this is something that isn't spoken about much in common practice. Many of us are evidence and we're so educated now that we often don't want to talk about the spiritual side of health afflictions. And I think for me, because I also have an interest in herbal medicine and traditional medicine practices, and coming from where I'm coming from, I know that one of the advantages that I think, because a lot of times, not in a bad way, I think a lot of religions and churches kind of unintentionally talk down our traditional culture. And one area that I think that we could probably learn a lot from is when it comes to health, because I think in traditional medicine, they kind of know that spirituality is very closely linked to our health and well-being. And so when you go to a herbalist or a native doctor, oftentimes a proper one, at least, there's a lot of quacks out there, but a proper one will also look at things from a spiritual health point of view. And I think that in an ideal world, that's what we would do in practice, but we know that that doesn't happen and that's unlikely to happen in real practice. That's why I'm kind of delivering a course like this. But I think that it's an important thing for us to speak about and for us to think about. And from my understanding, and I say this as someone that isn't a pastor, but is someone that is spiritual and has a personal relationship with God. So I'm talking a little bit. Just I think it's important I say that and clarify that. So I think there are three types of there's three probably root types of afflictions when you're looking at things from affliction from a spiritual standpoint. And I think afflictions could be divine, i.e., they could be godly. God gives afflictions, which we'll speak about. It could be demonic. I think a lot of people think more about it being a demonic one than a godly affliction, and it could also be genetic. And I'll explain to you what I mean in when I say genetic in the coming slides. So let's just do a quick root cause analysis. Why do divine afflictions happen? In other words, why would God afflict anybody? And I think sometimes we spoke about six principles of spiritual health principles in the first model. And one of the key things I was saying, if you remember, I talk about the importance of honoring God through honoring our bodies. And when we dishonor God, or we dishonor our bodies, because when we dishonor our bodies, we're actually indirectly dishonoring God, right? And we dishonor God, then sometimes He might give us an affliction because that's the only way, as a way of punishment sometimes or judgment. We don't see that as much in the New Testament as we see that there's a lot more examples of that in the Old Testament before Jesus Christ came. But I still somehow feel that it still happens today. And then sometimes he might do it because we've been disobedient, and again, some of those principles I said, a lot of them are based on the Bible. So if we're not eating healthy, if we're drinking a lot, we're kind of not really obeying him, and we can't claim the promise, and we can't, and anybody that preaches that is kind of not really telling the whole truth, because the reality is that if we're disobeying God, then we can't reap the promise. We can't, God is a God of principles. So if he said that he will protect us, there will be no barrenness, there will be no miscarriage, there will be no sickness, he will pass us by, then he can't do that if we're not doing what he said. Let's not miss out the part where it says if you obey. and if you're of service, so if you're doing the right thing and you're obedient to him, then you'll eat the good of the land, and that means that he will protect you from sickness. If we're being really honest, a lot of us, even the spiritual ones amongst us, even the Christians, sometimes we get sick because we haven't fully obeyed God. We haven't eaten the right food, we haven't exercised, we haven't done the right thing. So really and truly, we're not really being obedient. And if we're not really being obedient, then sickness can come to us. We can be afflicted. Yes, it's a natural cause and effect, but there's also a spiritual element to it, because even if, something like COVID, we didn't know the cause and it affected many of us. There were a lot of us that didn't get affected by it and wasn't disabled by it. And some of us, as a matter of principle, we were living right. But also God protects us, even because sometimes we can't cover all bases because our knowledge is limited. So God is a God of principle. And and there's some people that died, and there's some people that get sick because Christians do get cancer, do get sick. And sometimes it's because they haven't done the right thing and they're praying for a miracle. But if we're being honest, we haven't necessarily lived right, although God is merciful. And this is the thing, sometimes God is merciful enough to bless us with a miracle. But even if he gives us a miracle, we still have an obligation to maintain our health and well-being, to prevent that from happening again, or to prevent something else from happening. So divine afflictions happen sometimes because we disregard the word, or we disregard the knowledge we have. There are times where we don't have the knowledge. My people perish because we lack knowledge. We don't have the knowledge, but we're not even making an effort to get the knowledge from the right people. Other times we might not have the knowledge, but if we obey and we do the spiritual exercises, then I believe God will guide us to the point of telling us or informing us with the information that we need to know. Sometimes as well, it's a way of God showcasing his power. Um, and sometimes it's a way for God to get your attention. Sometimes he might give you something, maybe something as simple as high blood pressure, because for some people that might shake them up and enable them to get their house in order. And maybe they drank too much or ate too much. That's enough to say, okay, it's a warning. You need to cut back, or you need to do this better. So those are some of the reasons that I believe divine afflictions and afflictions come from God. Um, and a good example, sort of like a case study, was the story in the book of Samuel, where God was heavy on the people of Ashdod. And there were a few communities in that time, in that area, where I think basically the children of Israel had gone to war and they were defeated because, as usual, they were disobedient at some point, and those people had taken the Ark of God. And the Ark of God is only meant to be carried by certain people and be carried in a certain manner. And obviously, these people were a bit ignorant, just saw it as part and parcel of some of the spoils of war and took it and handled it anyhow. And so God caused them to get afflicted with tumors, in order to get their attention, and because that was his property essentially, and that was, I guess, that ark belonged to him and was sacred. And eventually, after a lot of people were afflicted, people died, etc., and it was devastating to their communities. As they did in those times, they sought spiritual insight to the situation. There's a lot to learn from this case study. So they sought spiritual insight because they kind of joined the dots that something wasn't quite right there. And then they got the word that they needed to return the ark of the God of Israel. And then not to just send it back empty-handed, but to send it out back with like a trespass offering, like a guilt offering. So I think this was also a learning point for me, because I realized there's different forms of offerings, and sometimes you can give a trespass offering as well. And that's why I kind of see a lot of similarities with traditional medicine, because sometimes I know we don't do that as Christians, but sometimes a native doctor will say that they need to offer a piece, or something, some form of, how do they put it? Some sort of acknowledgement to whatever God kind of thing. I'm not talking about doing that, but it's the principle. So anyway, which is similar to the Old Testament. So, and then they said they would be healed and his hand would be lifted, and they did that. On the other hand, Samuel also had to stand in the gap on behalf of Israel and offer a burnt offering to the to God to seek God's forgiveness. So we see that God's hand at work here and how God afflicted people because they disregarded his ark, his property that was sacred, even though to some extent they were unaware. So God gave that affliction to get their attention, to showcase his power as well. And those are some of the reasons why divine afflictions happen. So let's talk a little bit about why demonic afflictions happen. So it's very true, I think, when the Bible tells us that the devil comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. He's not playing. He doesn't come with any good intent. It literally comes. And that's why when demonic afflictions happen, you see someone feeling it's almost like they're being tortured, they're being oppressed. It's really the goal is to destroy and kill. But to show you how evil the devil is, it's about, it's not just to destroy and kill outright. It's like that kind of death that is involves a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of pain both to that person and to their loved one. And I guess this is where the similarity ends. The devil also wants to show he's got power. But as they say, in Nigeria, power past power. Some powers past power. So, and we know that God's power past power. So we don't have to worry about that, because if we call on God and we exercise, those principles we said, God will show up and his power is greater than all powers. But this is why demonic afflictions often happen. And you will often know if it's a demonic affliction because a lot of these things will apply in that scenario. So it's also about being sensitive spiritually, and your spiritual eyes, I guess, will be opened in some way to recognize it. But we'll talk a bit more about that further down the line. So let's look at some illustrative examples of demonic affliction. So we see a lot of that in the New Testament. It's quite interesting because in the Old Testament, we see a lot of things that where God was really showcasing his power and in some cases causing afflictions, etc. I think the New Testament is a little bit of the opposite because we don't see God afflicting people as much. Rather, we see him healing, demonstrating his healing power and showcasing his power through healing. But we do see the devil show up a lot. And we see like if the book of Acts tells us how God anointed Jesus with the Holy Ghost and power and to heal all those that were oppressed of the devil. So we see how, the devil's affliction is about oppressing. And we also see that a lot of the people that were brought to him were diseased. Not all of them, some of them were diseased. We need to be careful. Not all diseases and ailments are from the devil. Some of them are due to natural causes. Some of them are still due to godly afflictions. Some of them are just natural causes that have a spiritual element to them. So we need to just read the detail, all that were diseased and them that were possessed with devils. And he healed many that were sick of diverse diseases. God is not limited when it comes to healing, regardless of your condition. I think man is limited. We're limited by evidence. We're limited by stats, but God is not limited. And cast out many devils as well. And we also see here where it said the devil came out of people shouting when he healed them by laying hands on each one. So we see some live examples of this in the New Testament. And, most of those examples I've said illustrate the torturing, the oppression, and the goal really just to destroy and kill people and showcase their power. And I'm just going to touch now on genetic afflictions. So I'm talking about genetic afflictions really in the case of from a spiritual standpoint. I think many of us are aware of what it means to have genes and that some diseases run in families, some diseases we inherit because of our genes. So genetic afflictions, from my understanding, often happen when there's a curse. It could be known or unknown curses on a family. There could be covenants. Some of us our bloodlines. There were covenants that we have no knowledge of, but we're still suffering from today. So some of them are because of covenants, and some of them are ancestral sins. So sins that maybe our forefathers committed, and though we may not be suffering in the same respect as they did, in some way, shape, or form, we're still suffering from the effects of those sins. And I'll speak a little bit more about each of these in the coming slides. So let's look at some examples. So a good example of a covenant, I guess in a way you could say it was both a curse and a covenant that God put upon the children of Egypt, where he said, if you remember the story of the 10 plagues, and he said where he would strike down every firstborn and bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt, and saying that he is the Lord. And then where the children of Israel had to put, like, some blood on the top of their door of their houses so that he would pass through and they would be saved indirectly by the blood. The blood heals, the blood saves, the blood protects, the blood cleanses, the blood decontaminates. And this is an example, even before Jesus came, of the power of the blood, and where he passed through. So in that essence, God made a covenant with the children of Israel. Because of that covenant, the destructive plague did not affect them. So there may be epidemics, like COVID was a bit of an epidemic or a pandemic. HIV was a pandemic. I know of countries where I know someone that said that, when they left, when they left and they went back to their hometown, literally everyone in a childhood picture had died because of HIV, but she was still alive. So same with COVID. A lot of people died, but a lot of people survived. Some people were near death, but they pulled through. So the blood is a sign to pass over. And so that was a covenant God had with the children of Israel, and where he also afflicted the children of Israel. So we see a live example of a spiritual affliction as well as an example of a covenant. And then the Lord, in the book of Numbers, it talks about God being slow to anger. But however, God is a just God. Remember, I said that, sorry, my battery's going a bit low. Remember, I said that God is a just God and he's a principle God. He's a God of principles. So we see that he says he will not leave the guilty unpunished, and he punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. And this was in reference to when spies were sent to the promised land for them to survey the land and see what's in the land. And I think it took a long time for me to understand this, because I used to feel that's so unfair. Why would God punish me or someone for the sins that they didn't commit? And I think when I delved a bit deeper, I understood that it may be, for example, he struck down, like we talk about the affliction with the children of Israel. So those firstborn died. Maybe they had a disease. Let's say those firstborn were adults, were working, providing for the family. They had a disease and died. So it may be that their children or their generations to come don't get those same disease, but indirectly they still suffer from the consequences of that. That may be in the sense that poverty, because they become poor because they have no breadwinner. That may be in terms of the environment, that may be in so many ways. So it may not be directly. Sometimes it may be directly, but it may not necessarily be directly. But indirectly, they suffer. But God is merciful and just, so they might not suffer the same punishment. They may have the consequences, but God that's where revelation comes in. That's where the spiritual exercises come in. And that's where, by awareness, we then have a choice. And then, we can be set free from some of those sort of ancestral curses or ancestral sins that others before us may have committed knowingly. Somehow it's a bit like, if parents, maybe you have a parent that had HIV, for example, and the child is innocent, but maybe they passed it to the child. So the child is suffering because of the sin of that. Maybe that child has another child. That child is okay, but they suffer from broken families. So somehow, some way, these things have a way of affecting generations to come if someone doesn't identify it and do something about it, both in the spiritual and the physical sense of the word. So I hope that kind of helps you to understand what I mean when I say genetic health afflictions. So, how do you manage it? So, prevention, I think, when it comes to any type of affliction, physical or spiritual, prevention is key. Prevention is key. Prevention is better than cure, as they say. So, what evidence do we have that spiritual afflictions can be prevented? So, the evidence we have is very scriptural. There's more than one place in the Bible where it tells us if we diligently hearken to the voice of God, do what is right, listen to his commandments, keep his statutes, that he will ensure none of those diseases are put upon us. And if we are, for added measure, if by any chance we happen to get any of those, he will heal us. So he's already said it. He set the record straight before. So if you do end up with such, then you have to know that, number one, it may not be from God. It probably is not from God. And number two, it may be a case of applying your spirituality, and those spiritual exercises that we spoke about earlier come into play. And then also similarly in Ezekiel, it says, remember I was saying about children suffering for the sins of their forefathers. God is proportional and a God of principle. And he clearly says here is that if you as a child, because even though you're a child, at some point you become of age, you become aware, and my people perish because they lack knowledge, you kind of have an obligation to learn, to make yourself aware, to read, to study, and God will reveal the needful to you. And if something has been done wrong in the past that is affecting you, he will guide you how to overcome it and how to live your life right. But if you decide not to do that which is right and lawful, then surely you will reap the consequences and things will continue to go through the generations. But there are some things that don't need to pass through generations. There are some things that you have the power to stop, and that comes through obedience, and that will prevent further spiritual afflictions, either from God, because once you can obey God, deal with that side, you know that you're covered against even demonic afflictions. So you don't really have to worry about that. And then it says in the book of Psalm as well about him protecting us, that no evil will befall us and no disease will come near our dwelling. So it's quite there. The evidence is clear that we are covered and we are protected from that if we do what we need to do. And so, what are the actions to take in summary to prevent spiritual afflictions? It's remember to meditate on the word. We talked about applying the word, and the only way to apply the word is to know the word, and the only way to know the word is to study and meditate upon it. To honor God. If you honor God, inevitably he will honor you. And if you honor God, you will honor your body. And if you honor your body, he will honor you. And even when something happens, you can go back to God with clean hands and hold God accountable, and he will listen to you because he is a God of principle and understanding. And we see it even with Hezekiah when he repented and God gave him another 15 years. Compared to another king, I can't remember the king's name, I think it's King Asa, who refused to repent and he died. I think I mentioned that example later on. If submit to his will, walk in alignment with his will. We've spoken about some of the things that he's told us that we need to do in order to live healthy and struggle-free. And if we obey his word, and basically if we live right, then we have a leg to stand on. And even if we do get afflicted, it means we can go back to God and challenge him. So if you do happen to have what you think is a spiritual affliction, I guess the question is, how do you overcome that? And I think key is to seek divine input. Don't remember I said, the multitude of counselors, knowing who to go to at what time and not relying on your own capacity. So Asa, that's the king I just mentioned before. It's a similar story we see throughout the Bible. He actually started well as the king, but somewhere along the line, pride stepped in and he disobeyed God. And I think pride stepped in and he kind of chose to rely more on his own power than God's power. It's kind of the long and short of the story. And he got a disease, and the disease became really, really bad. I think there's some suggestion that it may have been an ulcer in his feet or sepsis when I did a bit of research. I don't know, but he had a very bad disease. And as a king, obviously, everything they try, he had the best doctors, the best apothecaries. So I'm sure he had the best people on his case. They tried many medicines, they tried many herbs, many doctors had intervened, and still nothing. And he had the opportunity to do something, and but he refused to seek God. He refused to seek. I think he even got a warning, and they told him that this is what he needed to do, and he needed to get back on track with God. And he refused. It's like he had become bitter towards God for some reason. Um, it's almost like sometimes I think there's a certain spirit that possesses people in power, and if you're not careful, it can take you to the other side. But like I said, anytime there's a demonic affliction, the goal is to oppress and to destroy and kill you. But if you're wise enough and you're able to open your eyes and seek divine input and repent, you can often, overturn things and avoid that. Asa didn't. He was too proud to do so, and so he ended up dying. So seek divine input. If you think you have a spiritual affliction, don't try to do it all on your own. And then don't forget, use and apply the word. This in Deuteronomy 8:3, this is the bit that Jesus quoted when the devil tempted him. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God is what we live. So if you make the word your own, meditate upon it, and use the word, that would also be a key way to overcome spiritual afflictions. And I'm just going to finish off this with some tips when it comes to spiritual afflictions and dealing with them. Don't allow yourself to be a victim. Um, so don't just wallow in self-pity. Stand up and do something about yourself, something about the situation. Be aware that we've mentioned genes, but similar to physical genes, you can influence the way those spiritual genes are expressed. So even though there may be things in your lineage, there may be covenants that have made, there may be things that you're not aware of that are affecting you. The key is if you're aware, you can influence the expression by doing the needful, by obeying God, by honoring your body, etc. You can kind of tailor those expressions, and also by walking in alignment with God and allowing God to guide you. You do need spiritual guidance to overcome spiritual afflictions, which can come from the word, through men of God, or through a multitude of ways. Use the power and authority given to you. God has already given power and authority and said that no, you will eat harmful food, it won't harm you. It said that he's given you the power to heal. He came to keep the captives free, to heal the sick. You already have the power and authority inside you, so use it. Spiritual exercise, the more you use it, the more powerful you become, and the more authority and confidence you get. Don't over rely on man or healthcare professional. We see with Asa the example, he was just reliant on doctors, even though he had what was clearly a spiritual affliction. So make sure God is involved in the process and the healing process. Make sure you obey and honor God in all your efforts when you're fasting. Don't patronize God. In other words, do what you need to do. Don't ask for a miracle when you know that you're not living your life right. That's like you're kind of patronizing God. Because even if he gives you a miracle, you still have to live right, because at some point, all that will happen is that same disease will resurface. Think about considering special offerings where there is a spiritual affliction, like the people of Asford, the people of the community I mentioned with tumors did. So think about, you may want to consider an offering, a special offering, in order to appease God. And there's power in praying with others. The Bible says, where two or three gather in my name, there I shall be. So, sometimes you may find it beneficial to actually join hands and pray with other people. So those are some of the tips that I think will help you in dealing with spiritual afflictions if you suspect or feel you may have one. So let's talk a little bit quickly about physical health afflictions. So Physical health afflictions happen for a number of reasons, some of which you already know. You know, if you eat certain food, you'll get high blood pressure or diabetes, for example. What I wanted to emphasize are the things that aren't spoken about much. And I have kind of done some courses about these, but I just want to mention them briefly. So things like lack of knowledge. The Bible says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. Ignorance is no excuse. That's why it's important to do different things, to learn, to open your mind to learning from different people and different things so that you're aware, because you know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. I remember when I first started working in practice, and I had one of the my clinical supervisors pull me up, had looked at one of my notes and said something because I was dealing with a patient, but I was so focused on some of the medicine, etc., that I picked up, she was short of breath. I picked up a few other things. And I remember my clinical supervisor was like, well, why didn't I do anything about that? That you've mentioned it, that, sometimes when you speak to a patient, even though you're focused, you have your own agenda, you need to be open to see other things. And some of those things may be even more important than what you think. And at that point, initially, I was a bit defensive because I was like, ah, why is this doctor questioning me? All those years of me questioning them, it kind of made me feel like, oh, this is what they must feel like. But then when she explained to me, I was actually quite grateful. And she used to, when I first started, she would go through some of what I did, etc., and correct me, etc. And it really helped me in terms of learning, in terms of thinking a lot more laterally. And I think that, so I think lack of knowledge is not an excuse. You should be willing to listen to the counsel of others around you that may know more or may have a different perspective. And then habits. I mentioned last model that the first 30 years, we make our habits. The next 30 years, our habits make us. So, identifying bad habits and trying to change those habits are probably more important than just taking different medications or trying other interventive tools, even if it's surgery. Some people do weight loss surgery and the weight still comes back at some point. So at some point, you still need to do the stuff that you may be running away from or may find hard to do. Mental health, a lot of times, is underestimated in terms of fear, anxiety, low mood. Sometimes people think they're doing okay, they're managing their mental health, but they're living a stressful life. And over time, that still has an impact on your health. So because you feel okay, doesn't necessarily mean your body is okay. So sometimes you do need to listen to the advice that is given and the things out there. And then you need to own your health. And then there's a lot of external influences, some of which you may have limited control over. But that's why the principles I spoke about are really important, because they will help you to deal with the seen, the unseen, and those influences that you may not have much control over. So, how do you prevent physical affliction? So, I'm going to refer you back to Model 1 because I've already spoken about all the things and the principles you need to abide by in order to prevent physical afflictions. Those things I spoke about will protect you from both physical and spiritual afflictions, but I've already spoken in detail about spiritual afflictions. So, physical affliction, I'll refer you to Model 1. How do you overcome physical affliction? So it's kind of the reverse of what I've said, and I've already touched on this, but just to summarize, acquire knowledge from different sources, be hygienic, be clean, um, have a good lifestyle. Try to get the right work-life balance. Don't overwork yourself. Don't be too busy to pay attention to your health and well-being. Find a way, and that's where some help, some guidance, some advice can come in handy in helping you to get that balance between work and life. Because there is a way to get it right, but it takes a little bit of insight and a little bit of thinking. And then try to influence your genetic expression. You can influence your genes, both in the physical sense and the spiritual sense. So even though you may be at a high risk of having certain conditions, that doesn't have to be the end point. You can kind of control the end point by taking ownership and by doing certain things. look to use a range of medical interventions, whether that be medications, supplements, herbs, surgery in certain scenarios. Engage with counseling, engage with a wide range of professionals. Don't just rely on one healthcare professional. Depending on your condition, you may find that some complementary therapy is also useful for your condition. Consider health product programs, holistic health programs similar to the HIP program that we run, which is a health improvement program that we run to help people achieve their goals, and is a holistic approach to tackling health challenges. Again, if you want more information on that, you can visit our website at www.westscionline.com, which is down here. But essentially, if you're able to do all these, even if you're able to focus on a couple to start with, I'm sure it will help you to get over the line if you already have an existing affliction. So, the last question you might want to ask when it comes to this model is, how do you know if it's a spiritual or if it's a physical affliction? So, 8 steps to determining the root cause. So, the first one on the list is to check yourself and be honest with yourself. Are you doing the right thing? Are you honoring your body? Are you honoring God? Are you abiding by those principles I said? If you're not, then it may be that you need to do those things first in order to identify whether or not it's still a problem. Know your history, know your physical history, know your spiritual history, know your family history. And when I say family history, it's not just about, oh, my mother had hypertension. What else was going on in your family? Was it something that's affected everyone? Is barrenness a common thing? Like we see even with like Isaac in the Bible and Abraham, we actually see infertility being a pattern. Obviously they don't have the knowledge now we have now. Maybe they would have identified other things, but if they were looking from a spiritual element, they could have seen, Isaac could have seen earlier on. It didn't have to take him 20 years to start praying for his wife. They would have identified it sooner. Maybe he would have started praying sooner. So know your history in your terms of your family and the patterns. Give a special offering. When those communities that had stopped taking the ark away from God, when they gave a special offering and they sought spiritual insight, it was revealed to them the cause of the problem, and they were able to rectify things and send the ark back and send it back in a special way. So special offerings may help in terms of you identifying the root cause and a solution to the cause. Identify the signs and the patterns. Honor God. In honoring God, you will make sure you honor yourself, because honoring yourself is a form of honoring God. Know your environment. Be aware of what's in your environment. Be aware of resistant situations. If the situation is very resistant and you're not necessarily honoring God, then it could be this is a spiritual affliction. And when the odds are against you, sometimes when the odds are against you, it's because there's a spiritual element to this condition. And sometimes it might just be that God wants to teach you or show you something, and that's how he's gotten your attention. It may not always be the devil. It may also be the devil playing games and just trying to make life hard. But if the odds are against you, then there's probably a spiritual element to what you're going through that probably needs some spiritual solutions to it. So I think that's where I'm going to end Model 2. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it insightful. I hope you're able to take something away from it. And, I don't think I mentioned this in Model 1, so let me just mention it here. Thank you for listening. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you've enjoyed this, because there will be more stuff coming along. And also, don't keep the good news to yourself. I'm sure that you know someone that is struggling. And a lot of times with health as well, there's a lot of stigma. So people might not want to say what they're going through. So please just share it. Let's get this to as many people as possible, because there will be some people that it will be a blessing to, but there are people that may be going through things in silence. And I rather them know, and that's another reason I did this course, because I think because of stigma, sometimes if when I do certain events or I do certain things, certain people don't come or they don't show their face because of the whole stigma around health. So I've done this so that people can share it widely and listen to it in their own space, without showcasing their face or anything. So please help me in just pushing this out and sharing it to as many people as you can. Stay blessed. Until next time, when we come back, we're going to talk about holistic healing in the third model. So I look forward to seeing you soon, but bye for now.